the insights that he has, but he has such an interest in religious liberty, and this is across all denominations, that he's keeping his ear to the wall all the time and just keeping an eye on what's going on in the world and how it affects Seventh-day Adventists and other Christians. Don?
I was talking to one of the former leaders of religious liberty department. He said this gentleman is one of the finest men we've ever had.
Well, I agree. I think we all agree. Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm looking forward to hearing what he has. He travels all over the world to a lot of very interesting sounding countries, and all in the name of religious liberty. And we can be extremely thankful and proud that we have Pastor Lincoln Steed in our General Conference. Pastor Steed, why don't you come up? Are you going to speak from down here, or are you going to? Yeah, okay. Why don't you come up?
Well, thank you. I feel like I'm very much back in my friends, not just at this church. Yes, I can do that. Let's have, you want to pray?
Yes.
Okay.
Kind Father in heaven, what a special privilege it is to have Pastor Lincoln Steed here. We realize, Lord, to fly all the way across the country is tolling and takes a toll on the body, and we just thank you for bringing him here. And we look forward to hearing what he has to share. We thank you that he has his ear to the pulse of what's going on in the nation and in the world. We are so thankful for the freedoms that we share here in America to worship freely in this church and all around the country. We just ask now that you would anoint his lips and bless him for coming here and bless us for having been here. Is our prayer tonight in Jesus' name.
Yeah, I was going to segue into a prayer, but thank you.
Sorry.
I'm not as formal as I should be. And with the sun up, and it doesn't feel like Friday afternoon, I guess I'm not in quite a formal meeting mode, but as I say, I do feel that I'm back among friends, not just at this church, but it hit me a few months ago when I was at a church whose name I can't remember, north of Seattle. Sandy, what was that church? Shoreline. At Shoreline. There were people from all over, and I realized that I've spoken at a lot of churches in this area, and I always like to come to Seattle, Portland, that whole area. And I think in this area there's a lot of Adventists that believe in religious liberty and clearly support it, not just by coming to meetings, but support what we're doing. I don't remember what I said then, and I hate to repeat myself. By the way, and I learned something today coming in and watching that program, and I do believe that some of you watch it regularly, because that's one thing that's impressed me as I've traveled around. Invariably, I'll come in the door of a church and someone will say, "Oh, we're just watching the program." And I feel that that's very effective to contact Adventists. It's one thing to fly here, as was said, it's on one level it's like a bus, but it's a long bus ride. And that's great, I enjoy it. But you could do that forever. I've often said about the General Conference President and the World Church, he can fly every day of the year, which he doesn't, to somewhere. And yet in total, the 7 million Adventists or so, most of them are never going to see a leader in person. But with television, you can sort of reach out and be there. And people believe they know you because they see you on that screen. It's a very personal contact. And I learned something watching that, to my chagrin. When we film the program, they're always asking me for a title. Not a title to go on the program, they say, just for the file. So I give very flippant sort of titles. And I see that they're repeated on our website. I mean, they're not inappropriate, but sometimes they're a little bit direct, and I need to watch it from now on. But I've told them at 3ABN they really should put a title on. But as far as they tell me, they just go out as the program. There's really not any title. I had an interesting series of recordings. Was it the last time? Time gets by. Yeah, about 6 weeks ago now. I was at 3ABN. And I took with me a Muslim imam. He's trying to remember his name now, and I know him very well. Imam Nasir. I thought he was an old man. We drove from the airport in St. Louis, about 2.5 hours to the 3ABN studio. It's a long way, and you seem like you're going to nowhere. I don't know how many of you know where 3ABN is, but it's in Thompsonville, Illinois, about 125 miles east of St. Louis, and you're just going into flyover country. It's pretty, but it's just flat. And as we were driving along, we spoke about many things, about some of the topics that we'd talk about. And at one point he says, you know, an old man like me can do something. And, you know, he had the silver beard and the old-fashioned Pakistani outfit, because he's originally from Pakistan. And I thought, man, he might not be as old as he looks. And I said, how old are you? And so we compared ages, and I found that I'm 3 months older than him. And it really shook me. Really shook me. But I do think that it shook 3ABN, perhaps even more, to have a Muslim imam from a mosque in California there discussing religious liberty and talking very freely about Islam. I think it was a wonderful opportunity for Adventists and those that watch our 3ABN, and of course it can be anyone that turns it on, but to see a Seventh-day Adventist Christian talking with a Muslim. And that doesn't happen very much in the open way that we're able to dialogue, except you do it under the auspices of religious liberty, true religious liberty. It's been a bother of mine, or an aggravation of mine, that of late the Seventh-day Adventist Church, if you read the review, brags now and then that it's in contact with Islam, and I just do not believe that, generally speaking, people are. They don't understand Islam. We don't communicate well to them. There's a lot of barriers erected on both sides. But I found that with religious liberty, you can talk to them. And I wrote an editorial on religious liberty recently, and it was really in the negative. I was in a bad mood when I wrote it, and it was to the effect that religious liberty means many things to many people. But flipping it on the good side, nobody's against religious liberty. It's like mum and apple pie. You will not find anybody that's opposed to it, even in the countries that don't grant it as we would like, because nobody would dare, even more than dare, nobody would try to position themselves as an enemy of religion. Even the secularists, they don't want to be an enemy of it, they just are dismissive of it. But religious liberty is something that goes to the heart of being a human being a child, to borrow from Rod McEwen, a child of the universe. You know, it's sort of a universal right that everybody feels comfortable with. Unfortunately, when people talk about it, they mean very different things. The religious right, they want the right to do their thing and to force it on society, if not just by aggressive talk, but by law. The Muslims, they believe in religious liberty because they want the right to do their thing. They're not so easy to grant it to other people or even to those of their own belief that want to leave. But yet everybody speaks well of it. And so it was a very comforting time to sit down with this man and talk about it. It was a little bit different than you might imagine, because he is a teacher in the Ahmadiyya Muslim sect. And we tend to think of Muslims as just one big amorphous group of a major religion. You know, it's Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims. And we know that it's not that simple within Christianity. We're Protestants, and within Protestantism there's dozens, hundreds of different little subgroups. There's Catholicism, there's the Eastern Orthodox, and so on. Within Islam, it's definitely broken up into at least as many groups, but there's some major groups. And since 9/11, you got a question?
I was just saying, the Ahmadiyas are not really Muslims.
Well, I'll explain that. Since 9/11, we've learned in the West a little bit about the major difference within Islam. There are the Shiites and the Sunni. Most Muslims around the world are Sunni. I read a statistic the other day that claimed 90% are Sunni, and I don't believe it's that high, but it's probably around 75, 80%. the Sunni, and they're the more moderate, we say. I don't think that's quite true, but within Islam itself, the Shiites are more frenetic and more argumentative and more a group that have a sense of injured pride, and they're more alienated from their Sunni majority. And the difference between Sunni and Shiites is nothing but a dispute over succession. I think it was the third caliph, the fourth caliph was assassinated, and in the search for a successor, and the first caliph was Muhammad, the prophet, who was the leader of Islam. And so after him were the other leaders, they were the caliphs. And the fourth was assassinated, and there was a dispute over who would follow him. The Sunni were the majority, and they were happy to choose an appropriate person from the tribe of Muhammad, which is the way it went through many hundreds of years. The Shiites wanted it to be Ali, the brother-in-law of Muhammad. They wanted a relative. So it's between nepotism and meritocracy. But on that difference alone, we have this huge dispute that the West is suddenly noticing. But doctrinally, it's no difference whatsoever. They both hold to the Quran, and they can both be very strict in certain situations. Beyond that, several centuries later, there was a group that began called Sufism, basically just a mystical approach to Islam, very much like developed at different times in Christianity. Under Catholicism, there were the Catholic mystics, and even in Protestant America, we've had people that were, even in Adventism, we had the pantheist movement with Kellogg, and that's really what Sufism was in Islam. They dropped some of the particulars of their faith and developed a generic idea that God was sort of imbued throughout the cosmos, and so they could worship just experience and nature and have ecstatic spirituality, and that was enough. They're not really widely or highly regarded by mainline Islam. But now the Ahmadiyya are very different, the Ahmadis. And maybe as a way to introduce them, I'll tell you what followed on from the discussions I had with this imam at our Liberty program. As we were driving back, he was pushing me to invite Elder Ted Wilson to their national convention, which was to follow in a couple of weeks. And I said, well, if he's around, he'll probably come. And I knew he wouldn't be around, actually, or I guessed he wouldn't be around. He's traveling all the time, and it turned out to be the case. Elder Wilson and a number of others have been very much preoccupied with the mission campaign in New York City. I'm sure you've read that in the review. So as it came closer to the day, I told Imam Nasir, I said, I'll come and talk to the convention. And he was happy to invite me. And so I went along to their annual national convention, not quite as big as the General Conference, and it was for North America, of course, but there were several thousand Ahmadi Muslims there in the Harrisburg Convention Center in Pennsylvania. I took my family, and I thought it'd be a chance for them to see another form of worship. You know, Adventists are very insular. Very few of us, unless we've come out of those companies, know how, what a Catholic Mass is like. Very few of us know what Pentecostal worship is like. And even fewer of us, I'm sure, have gone to Muslim assemblies or Buddhists and so on. I don't think we should be, spiritual kleptomaniacs, but that said, it's very educational to understand what people do in their worship. And I know my kids really, their eyes were just wide open the whole time. And the surprises for them began even before we got into the building, because as we came into the huge parking lot, there were attendants directing everybody, and I noticed there was a sign that says women's section for parking. And the women all parked in a certain place. They offloaded at a certain place. And we found when we went inside, they were meeting in a separate place. It was only the men all gathered in the main assembly. And there was good representation from the government and religious liberty groups. We even sat next to the woman that I know very well from the Scientologists. Another crazy, well, not another crazy, but another group that you might think has a crazy belief system. There was the mayor up front, there was the not local, but the congressman for their district. There was the Christina Lantos Sweat, who's the new head of the US Commission for Religious Freedom, connected with the State Department. She was there. They had a lot of dignitaries there. They had some academics, I think, who were Ahmadis themselves, but they were US nationals. And it was an interesting moment. And then when I got up, or as I got up to speak, I thought, what do I tell these people? Because Christina Sweat and others, they've got national security interests in mind and so on, and they're sort of bending over backwards to sort of diminish the differences on these Muslim beliefs and American culture. And there's a huge gulf. Just the fact that here you're talking to several thousand people, most of whom sitting on the floor, all of whom, except for a few guests, were men, many of them dressed in foreign garb, a lot of them Pakistani, but not all. And at different times when their own people were speaking, someone would call out something and then the others would echo, sort of antiphonal response from the crowd. That's not Western culture. That's not Christian style. And the imam had told me, he says, when you talk, he says, at least make reference to the persecution of Ahmadis. And as was said earlier, the Ahmadi Muslims are persecuted within Islam, particularly in Pakistan. They had their own succession crisis shortly after their beginning in the late 1880s. And on the death of their founder, there was a dispute over who was going to head up the organization. And the mainline Ahmadi organization settled itself in Lahore, Pakistan, even though the founder was born in India. And a majority of the nearly 10 million by official figures, maybe 2-3 times more than that by their own figures, a good percentage of that group live in Pakistan. They're scattered throughout the Muslim world, and there are not huge numbers, but significant numbers of them in the Western world. And I'm telling you at great length about them because you're very likely to bump into them if you contact Muslims. They're more than likely the Muslims that you will meet. They are not as hardline, and they have a distinctly different doctrine than Sunnis and Shiites. So when I was sitting there just before I got up, they gave me a Quran, which I've read before, and you should read that if you want to know about Islam. It's got some shocking stuff in it. But they had their own translation, different than the one that I'd read before, and I was bemused reading through that, how it whitewashed a lot of the most extreme statements. It was still there, but in very benign language. So when I got up, I thought, what do I say? Do I just tell them, we support everything you do, and make out like there's hardly any distinction between Muslims and Christians? There's huge distinctions. So when I got up, I made a point of telling them that I was there to represent the Adventist Church, that we believe in religious liberty, and one of the reasons that we believe in it is because we have been persecuted. And you know that. I'm sure you've read it in Liberty and seen it on some of our programs, that in the early days of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, when in the 1880s there was only 15 to 25,000 Adventists in that period. Did you know that? That's almost nothing. And during that period, up to 900 Seventh-day Adventists, mostly in the South, were imprisoned for breaking the blue laws. And a number of them, we have photographs of them, were on the chain gang down south. It wasn't for long periods of time, but they were publicly shamed and mistreated, some of them during their periods of imprisonment. And Seventh-day Adventists were thoroughly marginalized by the Christian community. In fact, the only reason that we formed a church, if you read your church history, was that the Millerites, and then those of the Millerites who stuck to that view after the Great Disappointment, were progressively ejected from the mainline churches. They did not automatically want to separate themselves and make another organization. They saw themselves, as we still do, as a reform movement. So there was persecution within the church and within the society. And I noticed that you're watching that episode that we recorded of persecution within the church. We were talking in code on that television program a lot, because I've had a lot of people standing up and complaining about things that are troubling them, or people are troubling them within the Adventist church. And they think that it's a religious liberty question. It might be a matter of freedom of conscience, but it's not a classic religious liberty issue within the church, because you have freedom of association. Nobody is forcing you to stay with this group. But when I stood up, I brought out the parallel between Seventh-day Adventists and the Ahmadis as a persecuted minority. I brought out the parallel that we are a reform movement within Christianity, within Protestantism, and they see themselves as a reform movement within Islam. And you could do a whole study on what was happening around the mid-1800s, from 1844 until about 1880. But during that period, any number of religions and sects came into being. And that's when the Ahmadis were formed. And I just believe that it was part of the stirring that was going on, some by God's Spirit and some by a false spirit to create confusion. But the founder of the Ahmadiyya movement, I should remember his name, I've got it written down. My memory's failed me, but I need to read it to you so you're familiar with his name. The founder of the movement, who had been born in India, his name is Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. And that's where you get the term Ahmadis, followers of Ahmad. The founder came up in 1889, significant date. 1888 was the A.T. Jones revival time and the great crisis on the Sunday law. But the Ahmadi movement came up as a reform within Islam, because they felt that Islam was becoming too lax. And there's a great irony here, because I will tell you, and you'll hear and read, that the Ahmadis are a benign form of Islam. They're not as aggressive in the sense that they'll declare jihad on you and cut your throat, but they are not mild proponents of Islam. They believe Islam should go everywhere. And the way that they want to accomplish that is to appropriate Christ. So I told them that we are reform movements. We are persecuted minorities. We believe in the Christ. But I said, and I gave a few direct statements. I said, we believe that Jesus came directly, that he was the Son of God. Now, they didn't say anything, but the Quran denies that. The Quran denies that Jesus was the Son of God, just a prophet. The Quran that I read, that's the official English translation that the Saudi Arabians agree with, it says they do blaspheme who say that Jesus is the Son of God. It says God has no son. So I used the moment with the Ahmadis to proclaim Jesus, and then I said something that we need to remind ourselves when we're talking about religious liberty. I said, I have no inclination to try to define your religion or mine as similar and the same and just sort of mix it all up. I said, it may be that some of your beliefs I find deeply troubling, as you probably will of mine. But we need to realize that such a value as religious liberty is inherent in our status as human beings, as creatures of a creator God. And I told them about how, and I'm sure some of you remember this when I was here last time, when I was in Ambon in Indonesia, where they had religious war between Christians and Muslims. When we arrived, we went to the Adventist church, and we were singing hymns there as part of our worship. And I don't know Indonesian, so I was just singing phonetically, but I noticed in the hymnal, whenever the word God came up, it was Allah. It's the same word. And so I said to the Ahmadis, we're calling on the same God. not the same way. We describe him differently, but we are reaching for him. And if we have any understanding of this Creator God, he gave us the ability to choose, and we must respect other people's right to choose and their right to choose wrongly. And I don't speak to people to hear them applaud, because they often don't. And what we these things that we say on religious liberty, they're troubling to many people on occasion. But I was very gratified, and the Scientology woman noticed it too, because she emailed me later. They applauded and applauded. They didn't applaud for the other English-speaking people, other than when they're finished. It obviously hit pay dirt with them. And yet with Muslims, they like to think that you sort of endorse their religion of peace and that the prophet is a valid prophet. I don't particularly think either of those things. But I have to respect these people. And there are, I think, 30 million Muslims in the United States today. Huge number. We're not anywhere near close to becoming a Muslim country, but we're getting to the point, as Canada did a while ago, where it's not uncommon to see a mosque by the side of the road. It's not uncommon to go into convenience stores, especially in the big cities, and see the women and Western women, not Pakistanis or Middle Eastern women, with the headdress. It was an interesting moment, and I know even my wife was a little startled, and she'd been with me in some Muslim countries before, but she was startled when we sat down for dinner. In fact, she decided to sit at a table where there were already 4 young women sitting. Very fresh-faced, outgoing young women. Turned out to be 4 sisters from Pakistan, all with the full face mask. You could only see their eyes. They were teenagers. And they had a wonderful, open personality, and yet we were thinking, what an imposition their religion has made on them, where they're actually hidden and restricted. We found that they had been put out there to sort of socialize with us, but then the men came along and they told them, go here, do this. It was not as free and open as it appeared. But I've thought a lot about how we interact with other religions after that. It just resonated with me. And I wanted to share again with you what you probably know and remember, but we don't recount it very often. In Acts chapter 17, tells the story of Paul on one of his missionary journeys to Athens. Paul, we know, studied with Gamaliel. Don't really know what he studied. He says it was the law. It was the principles of Judaism, but I wonder if he didn't study a little bit more, a little bit of philosophy and so on, because he was easily able to connect with non-Jews when he spoke philosophically with them. And he tried this in Athens. But it's interesting, if you read along there, it says in verse 15 it says that he went to Athens and he waited for Silas and Timothy to come. He sent for them to come quickly. And it says in verse 16, now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. And really, that should be us. We believe in religious liberty, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be stirred by what's happening. At the moment, I'm in the middle of this debate over the Supreme Court knocking down this defense of marriage thing. I think it was a reasonable legal act, but as far as what's going on morally, it's a sign of a horrible decline in public morality. We should be stirred by what we see with these things. The public sense of morality and obedience to the precepts of God is just drifting away by the moment. And it says Paul was stirred by what he saw, wholly given to idolatry. And in verse 17, therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. That's us. We're arguing among ourselves all the time. The Seventh Adventist Church, at least in North America, by my reckoning, is great in disputing stuff among ourselves, but they were hardly known outside our own gates. It's good that Ted Wilson's done this evangelistic session in New York, and he's done it well personally. But I did notice They gave the number the other day. It was a couple of tens, was it 30 or 70 people have come in through that effort. That's good. But think what that means for New York City. What is that, 10, 20 million people in New York? We're not making any dent there at all, but we make a big noise among ourselves. And that's what Paul found with the Jews. They like to argue. He got into big disputes with them. What is the dispute? They didn't agree with him. They didn't accept what he was saying. And it says in verse 18, then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and the Stoics, two of the philosophical trains of thought in Greece, encountered him. And some said, what will this babbler say? Others, he seemed to be a setter forth of strange gods because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. So he got their attention. He was talking not just in their language, even though he was presenting new things, but he was speaking strange and attractive doctrines, and they wanted to hear more about it. And it says in verse 19, and they took him and brought him into the Areopagus, saying, may we know about this new doctrine whereof thou speakest. That was the public forum. I know in Australia where I grew up, anybody that wanted to talk about anything could go to the Domain, it was called, down in the Hyde Park area, the public park. There were gardens and all around, but in the Domain area was fair go. As long as you didn't hurt anyone, as long as you didn't accost anyone, you could say whatever. And I can remember as a kid going in Sydney with my dad. He used to like to go down there, and you'd see people up on, they'd literally have a little box, a soapbox. They'd stand up on it, and I can remember the guys talking about communism. There were the ones now that have gone mainstream, but people arguing against patristic society and the false value of the family that Christianity had put on society. And there were all sorts of demagogues standing up, holding forth. That's what it was like in Greece. And they put Paul up there, and they said, we want to know what this means. And then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. We have to proclaim our distinctives to the heathen, I believe. And you're getting me at a bad time, but I'm older than I thought I would ever be. I'm bolder than I ever thought I would be. I'm feeling less influential than I ever thought I could be in the church. I'm happy to be editing Liberty. But I'm troubled that we are not speaking. When I say we, it's all of us corporately, even though you and I might be doing something sometimes. But as a group, we don't speak out. And even on our religious liberty work, and many of you have not, most of you have not had a chance to come to the General Conference. There's the wall of the Rogues Gallery, I call it, near John Gratz and his associates section. They're meeting more consciously, a lot of the different leaders, and they'll have a photograph with this person and that person. And I know that it's not very hard to get those pictures. You go to those events and people line up, and they come one at a time and look at the camera and get the picture. It's good that we're there, but what good is it other than a certain PR aspect unless we've told them something about what we stand for? It's just really getting a hold of me that we need to project our view. We don't have to do it in a pamphlet style or buttonholing someone. And, do you believe in Jesus? Do you believe He's coming? But we need to get in capsule form our ideas across to people so that they know what we stand for. And Paul says, God hath made the world and all things therein, seeing that He is Lord of heaven and earth. And He dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands as though He needed anything, seeing He giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord And if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. That was a very important statement that he made, quoting their poetry. And if you know that poetry, you understand Greek and Roman history and the devolution of the Roman emperors. You know, today it seems crazy when we hear that Caligula particularly, and some of these other emperors announced to everyone that they were gods. They weren't totally crazy, even though Caligula was criminally insane. They got that idea from that poetic view, that they all had participated in the divine spark. We had inherited from the divine part of this element of the divine. And so it wasn't so fantastical as you might imagine to claim divinity. You just claim, by making that claim, you personified in a very unique way what everybody shared. Here, you were an example of what the gods were doing with humans. And I believe even today, even in the United States, we can invoke the Creator God, the God that made this country, that made it great. We worship that God. This God is warning us, even warning this country, that if it doesn't turn, horrible things are going to happen. What does Ellen White say? That when the Sunday law comes, this country will rapidly repudiate every principle of the Constitution. That's an incredible statement. I used to think it was some sort of formal repudiation where we strike them off the Constitution. I don't believe that'll ever be so. But as we're now doing with the gay marriage, we'll just strike down the great moral imperatives that made our society great. They're disappearing. This is not a Christian society in the structural sense, but in the practical societal sense, it was far more committed to a biblical absolute in prior days than it is now. And as Ellen White and the pioneers did with the temperance movement, I believe we have a role today, and it can be done very effectively through religious liberty. We have a role to reach out and to link our particulars in a comment on what's happening in our nation at large. That's a very different thing from being politically involved. I'm still convinced that it should be anathema for Adventists to be involved directly in the political process. But, you know, it's our right to vote and so on. That's not what I mean. But to see it as our personal role to become a congressman, to do this and that and the other, I think it's not that that's evil in itself, but it shows someone has gotten derailed from putting God first, and as a Seventh-day Adventist, working toward a warning message and a preparation for his coming kingdom. That's probably a good time to finish and maybe have a few questions, because I've probably spurred you on a few things. But I just wanted to put that in front of you with Islam and that context, because it's something that we've all thought about a lot since 9/11. The answer has not yet been given to us, and as we've seen in Egypt in the last few days with the collapse of the Muslim Brotherhood's regime there. We're not finished, though, with the story of radical Islam and its troubling of the world and causing some final events. And I'll just finish, since I brought it up, with Mohammed Morsi and his removal. You know, we're all watching to see what will happen, and nobody really knows. But I put it to you, it would be extremely naive to think that this is the end of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think it's the most dangerous pass imaginable. They were in an untenable position coming into power because their country had been roiled by mass agitation, which had, among other things, driven all the tourists away, which is their main source of income. So even if he'd been a good ruler, there was no way that he could appear to be effective to the rank and file. And so things were going down, and it was looking bad for him, and he acted autocratically. And I believe the signs are just staring us in the face that the US pulled the plugs on him. Because other than tourism, The only single source of revenue for Egypt is foreign aid. It's several $1 billion a year that we give to the military. And so the military pulled the plug. But what this will mean now, that as with Mubarak, where he imprisoned the Muslim Brotherhood, and most of the ranking Muslim Brotherhood are in jail again, now they go radical again. And now in a country where 80% of the population are Muslim, radical Muslims, or not radical, but conservative Muslims, I think the bottle is closed and it's going to be shaken, and something quite startling will come out of this. So we need to pray for Egypt. We need to pray for the world that radical, fanatical religion will not win the day, and that this little time of peace that the Bible speaks about will continue long enough for us to spread the word, perhaps even to the Middle East, which needs it badly. Okay.
I think one of the biggest mistakes that we as Adventists are making is being religious isolationists. I just finished reading the book. You probably read it also, Damascus Rising, I believe it was. It was
I'm familiar with
a novel about the Middle East, and it was talking about how Iran, we should not be...
Can you hear at the back?
No.
Is there a mic to bring down? If not, maybe to turn around when you ask a question.
I think we're making a mistake by looking at Iran and saying we're really worried about it being a bomb. All they have to do is get involved with Pakistan. Pakistan already has so many bombs and so many missiles that are able to send them anywhere in the world, and that's what's behind, according to this book I read, what's behind the idea of the Ahmadi is to get Pakistan to declare him and turn over all the missile systems to this radical organization. How do you feel about that?
Well, there's plenty of things that can worry you, and I don't know about you, but I've been worried ever since I was a kid about nuclear weapons in Australia, which probably had more cause to worry than the US because the nuclear submarine antenna system is based in Australia, so almost certainly the first bomb would have gone to Australia. But I used to see articles in the paper, and I might have mentioned it before, but it really it tickles me now. But I believed it when I was a kid. They'd have a photograph of Sydney Central and the General Post Office in the middle, and that was ground zero, and then they'd have circles of destruction. And, we were like 14 miles out, and we were in the period where you'd get burned badly, but you might survive. And I remember thinking, wow, we might survive. Well, I don't think the Russians or anyone would have cared or been good enough to drop it right over the GPO. So we were all living in a fool's paradise, and I've seen films in this country where they were telling the kids to get under the desks and so on. We've lived in a time of fear for a long time, and we've gotten used to it. Since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, we think that it's fairly safe. In reality, it's much more dangerous than it was during the Soviet era. By the time we got to the end of the Cold War, I'd started reading a bit and traveled to a few countries, and it's sort of abundantly obvious to me the Soviets never wanted to attack us. It was an ideological war, and they were not friendly toward us, but they were not crazies. They didn't have a death wish. But in reality, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, those weapons are now unmonitored largely. All of the stuff that the Soviets had are in their satellite countries under varying degrees of control. I read an article not long ago where the Minister of Defense for Russia briefed the U.S., came to the U.S. and briefed the U.S. military, and what was it? I think it's 80 suitcase bombs are missing. They don't even know where they are. I read a book the other day that gave a lot of chapter and verse and names and times and places, and it claimed that the Al-Qaeda has brought in, I think it was 3 suitcase bombs into the U.S. It also claimed that the Soviets had brought in several dozens of bombs and pre-positioned them during their era. I mean, the reality is we're living under the Damocles sword, and we have all of our life. The reality is that Pakistan has it. They won't drop it on us, they'll drop it on India. But the world could go up in a moment between those two countries. Pakistan and India have been to war 3 times that I can remember. And when you go to Pakistan and India, you know that both of them, it would solve a lot of their problems if 10, 20 million people disappeared in a flash. It's not an unthinkable thing for such countries. If they could get rid of their archenemy, they would do it. And yes, you're right. I don't think Iran is inherently an enemy of the US. It's certainly, even if it had the bomb, it wouldn't particularly want to bomb us. It might bomb Israel. But the end result of all of this is not so much that we are going to be destroyed by nuclear weapons, but it reminds you that man is just ready to destroy himself, and that it's the restraining angels that hold this. And so why are they holding it at this point? We're told in Revelation, and Ellen White makes it plain, they're holding back the winds of strife until we have been sealed, and I believe implicit in that is by being sealed until we are fulfilling our charter as Seventh-day Adventists, as Reform revivalists, and make the proclamation. Once that's done, I believe it'll happen, whether it's Pakistan and India, or whether it's Iran to Israel, or remember, Israel's got plenty of them too. There are ancestral hatreds of religious and ethnic type that could more than account for any number of flashpoints. And not to mention the fact that we still have it. Remember, you read things now and then that little news curiosities, but if you really think about it, they're very dangerous. A plane, a US bomber, flew across the US the other day with nuclear weapons, and they didn't realize that it had nuclear bombs on it. Remember that? And as I seem to remember too, another one was dropped accidentally over mid-America once. Well, it didn't explode. They have a triggering mechanism, but there's plenty of signs that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, even the US doesn't monitor these things as it should. Since 9/11, we've seen that not with nuclear, but with torture and other things, the US is prepared to do as evil a things as the Japanese and other people did in other wars. It's human nature directed by Satan to do unthinkable things. Just last night, I watched a program that got my attention because it was about Australia. And they took people in tunnels under Sydney, where I grew up, and talked to some old guys that were in the military. And I did not know this, that in World War II, Australia had massive stocks of mustard gas ready to gas the Japanese when they invaded. That was forbidden by international covenant at the time. They were ready for maximum germ warfare. And so, yeah, on one level, I could be as afraid as anyone, but we shouldn't get fixated on this. The US government, I don't think, understands Iran or many other countries not very well. But the issue is not whether Iran will get nuclear weapons. There is such evil abroad in the land. Down southern US, for example, I saw in another program, there's a warehouse a quarter of a mile long with 44 barrels high to the ceiling. I saw it on video, and it's VX is being stored there, and they said it's bug spray for humans. The most microscopic drop on your skin and you're dead within seconds. The US has massive amounts of that. Why do they have it? They planned on disseminating that against their enemies. It's unthinkable destruction that's been stored up. And Revelation talks about it. The nations are preparing for war. But I just don't believe they will be allowed a final destruction until the final message is given. We shouldn't get things on their head. The Christian right have this conflation of biblical prophecy with the state of Israel and the return of the Jews and all the rest. And they're trying to drive political events, not realizing, while there is some involvement in Revelation and Daniel on the state of Israel at the end of time, that the driver of the events is spiritual, not political. Any other questions?
You answered about why are we such religious isolationists as a church? We don't know very much about Islam, and I think this is by choice.
Well, that was my point in talking this afternoon. I just to pique your curiosity in Islam. No, I don't think the Adventist Church knows much of anything about other religions, and we're forgetting about the Roman Catholic Church. If you read Great Controversy, you'll learn quite a bit. If you watch what's happening today with the Roman Catholic Church, you'll see echoes of yesteryear with the Roman Catholic Church. I'll say very freely that Roman Catholicism at the moment is sort of held in check by its own re-evaluation of Vatican II. But that doesn't mean they've changed. They've sort of put the cork in the bottle. And as long as the cork of Vatican II holds, we deal with them on religious liberty. They've become the leading force in the world for religious liberty. And we have to give them some credit for that. It's based on their document that came out in the 60s as part of Vatican II, the dignity of man, the dignitatis humanae. And I'm giving a bit of the talk that I might give tomorrow afternoon. But a few months ago, I was at an event at Catholic University where Cardinal Dolan was speaking, and he's taken the lead. He's the head of the Catholic bishops. He's taken the lead in attacking the Obama administration for their healthcare program. And so he was playing, the victim on religious liberty and saying that he needed to fight for it and so on. And then he hesitated, and it was very interesting. He was mostly talking to Catholics. It was at their university. It was for Catholics, but there were a few others invited, but probably 95% were Catholics. And he paused and he said, there was a time when Roman Catholics would not have supported religious liberty. He said there was a time when we held that error has no rights. That's the default setting of Roman Catholicism. And once they give way on Vatican II, they will revert to that. And if you read anything about the internal politics within the Catholic Church, you'll know that there's a roiling dispute over whether the Church should rethink Vatican II and go back to its historic role. Even John Paul II and Benedict, who both had some little part in Vatican II, came to think that it was a mistake and were pushing it back to a more conservative era. And Ellen White makes it plain. She says that Rome says she has changed, but she is unchanged, and that all the errors of the past will be repeated. So we're on the verge of them sort of uncloaking themselves. But this is this little moment of peace in a sense, even though the world is flying apart. We've never had a better relationship with Rome on religious liberty, and there's nothing wrong with that. We can work with them as long as they're supporting religious liberty. That's not agreeing with their doctrines. We should work with them on that to defend religious liberty, work with them on that to communicate our views to them, and then when the shift comes, stand our ground. You have a question?
Any comment on Jonathan Cahn's The Harbinger?
Explain more. I read a bit about it the other day, but it's not all. I can't bring it all back. This is this prophecy. Yeah.
I just encourage you to see.
I think this is the guy. I looked at it on the internet the other day and analysed. Well, as long as people are reading Great Controversy and understand that, then we'll be fine. But we shouldn't follow after every untested idea when we haven't followed what we have. Going back to the Ahmadiyya Muslims, maybe I didn't explain the founder was troubled by what was going through Islam at the time, a certain vulnerability to Christianity. And so he revealed himself as who he said he was, primarily to take away the attack of Christianity. He felt that Muslims were too vulnerable to Jesus. And so the founder said that he was the fulfillment of all of the great religions, the personage that they all expected. He was the Mahdi for the Muslims, he was the Messiah for the Jews and the Christians, he was the Buddha for the Buddhists, and Krishna for the Hindus. And what did Jesus say? He said, as Christ, many will arise, don't go after them. False prophets will arise, don't go after them. And yet, in Joel it says, you young men will, what is it? Old men dreams and young men visions, isn't it? But there has to be spiritual stirrings, but they're stirrings on top of an understanding of truth that's been received. I don't know how much longer. How about a couple of more questions, and then maybe tomorrow afternoon. On one level, I get not intimidated, but embarrassed by these sessions. I don't know everything, but usually I know most of the questions. Because we do these a lot, and I know the things that are troubling Adventists because they state them, and we're studying those things. But once you know the principle on these, it does sort of add some more sense to a whole waterfront of bubbling ideas.
I talked to you up in Victoria, Canada for about an hour, so you answered all my questions.
Oh, that's good.
What I was going to say is that they just opened a $7 million mosque of this religion.
Yeah.
And it was all raised by the local congregation, all to the penny. It's 2,000 people.
Wow, pretty good. No, Islam is on the move. It's not been troubled by 9/11. And this is one of the things that I discussed with the Imam, and he agreed with me that bad news and even harassment generally tends to grow an organization. And I don't want trouble in my own life or as a Seventh Adventist Christian, but just looking at it logically, the greatest thing that could ever happen to Adventists in North America is trouble. Then we'll be noticed, I believe. Then the ones that are hangers-on will fall away. Others that have been watching us and not sure what we're about will get it clearly and join. And a number of us, I think, will get really serious and we'll be noticed. Today, I mean, in the worst sense, when these two guys do this thing in Boston, I mean, there's just ad nauseum articles about what radical Islam is and what they were doing in Chechnya and all of this stuff. It's incredible. We should never come to attention for bad reasons. So, God forbid that there should ever be Adventists doing, as Paul says, that are lawbreakers. We should never be such things. But if our faith were questioned and we were brought up before authorities on it, this guy down in Florida, I mean, the last few days I couldn't be in any restaurant or anywhere without seeing it. In fact, in the hotel room, I did 6 channels in a row. Dunk, dunk, dunk. They were all on that court case. You think if an Adventist was standing up there on some high-profile thing because they would not do so, like if he was I'm hesitating on this because I don't really like sports. I used to edit Listen magazine, but like say it was a Michael Jordan type figure, and he converted to it. Well, we had a figure. He's gone though. This kid that was on 2 Men and 2.5 Men or something. I don't watch it. I don't like it. He made a good statement to a point and then vanished, and I've heard not good things beyond. But if he had kept that witness up, I mean, that would make a big noise in the entertainment industry and on all of these cable channels that people watch. And if that was just one of several things growing like that, people would talk about it. I mean, think about Scientologists. They claim there are 1 million Scientologists in this country. I don't believe so. And I deal a lot with the Scientologists. In fact, I'm going to go and visit their headquarters and their publishing entity in a couple of weeks. But think of the influence they have when Tom Cruise and someone else goes on an interview and talks ad nauseum about his faith. People are listening. They're soaking that in. And they're people that are uninformed about basic Christianity. They're babes in the wood. So, this is great truths coming through to them. But if they heard real truth, someone talking naturally about what the Bible Sabbath and why we hold it. It's not just a Jewish day, but here it's enshrined in the Ten Commandments. It's an eternal law and so on because of the Creator. I think that would make a difference, but they're not hearing that. They're not getting stuff, and I have a bit of a difference with our lawyers at the moment. They think that we're sort of proving a point by making a legal challenge here or there. That gets you known in the negative. And even to defend our name. It's one thing in the meeting I had up at Shoreline. I hope they weren't recording it because they're very sensitive about these things. And I can't be against the church, but I think that's ill-advised to take a legal defense of your beliefs or your name. Be better to stand on principle and then come up against someone else's legal challenge to what you're doing.
I have a couple of questions, a couple of things. Speaking of, you were speaking of Pakistan a lot, and also about the news, about this case being on. So, do you happen to see this evening on the news the young Pakistani teenager Malala, the one who was shot in the head?
No, I didn't turn it on this afternoon. Yes, I know a lot about that story.
She's recovered. And
Yeah.
She addressed the United Nations.
She's in London, though, isn't she?
No, she's in New York.
Oh, but she's living in England, I think,
She
yeah.
addressed the United Nations today, and her message was, she was shot by the Taliban, and
Yeah.
because of her, she supported religion, or not religion, but education, and her message today was, you can try to kill me, but you can't stop education.
Yeah.
I thought,
No, that's someone with integrity. And the Taliban and the hardline Muslims need to be called because they're I mean, it's a double-edged sword because they are pushing their religious viewpoints. That is what their religion calls for. But in their case, it needs to be seen that this is a false religion or a falsely applied religion that's demeaning creatures of a creator God. I think that's the way we should come at it. A universal human right that's being abridged there.
my other question is a little closer to home. If you care to give your opinion, what is your take on the organization of the organization of the Sekulow brothers, J. Sekulow, what is it, ACLJ?
Yeah, American Center for Law and Justice. Well, they do many good things, but you need to understand again where they're coming from. They have an American exceptionalist viewpoint. That's the term that they themselves will use. I remember, what's his name? Fellow we honoured at our dinner from the Southern Baptists. He went on TV and actually said that he believed in American exceptionalism. Once you believe that this is a favoured nation, that we exist under the direct mandate of God, and that our charter is to basically spread godliness throughout the world, then religious liberty challenges, you come at them a little bit differently. And what I'm always saying in Liberty, but nobody ever has gotten mad about it because I think they don't understand really what I'm saying. It's the exact parallel to the Taliban and the fundamentalist Islamic forces in some of those Middle Eastern countries. They see it exactly the same. We just don't cut off hands here, but it's basically the same model or the same expectation of how religion relates to the state. But many of the individual cases that Sekulow and his organization take on, they're fine. And I don't believe they're bad people. They've just adapted a false model. And I often talk with Cliff Goldstein, who preceded me. We both get philosophical at times. He loves philosophy and speculation. But I point out to him, and he agrees, that most every system is logical within the system. the only explanation as to why the world is so at odds with itself, and and there's such extreme views here, and someone else holds this, is there's certain predicates that you have to have within your thought system. And of course, as believers in God, the Bible says you must first believe that He is. Once you pass that hurdle, you don't have to worry about the evolutionists and all the rest, secularists. You believe God. Once you believe God, and once you believe that He speaks through the Bible, then within it, it's internally consistent. And then on religious liberty, as I say, the secular and the others, they believe that this is basically a religious nation. Well, once you hold that model, they consistently apply it. But from outside, it's sort of dangerous. But I don't believe they're bad people. But Adventists generally are uncritical, and they're sending not so much to secular, but they're sending a lot of their money, I believe, to Dobson and similar organizations, believing that that's the best way to spend it. And I haven't seen Dobson for a long, long time, but when I first started, I got to sit next to him at a dinner, and we talked about this. And he said, it was very interesting. He said, told me that he'd written a letter to the General Conference objecting to someone, wasn't me, but someone saying that he was bringing in the Sunday law. And I knew about the letter, and he says, I'm not bringing in the Sunday law. And I said, of course you're not. But I said, some of the things you're doing that you're supporting have as their end point a Sunday law. And he couldn't say anything, because that's true. Once you get your head around the idea that it's acceptable to have the legislature, by force of law, adopt regulations that have a basis in your belief system, then it's open go. Eventually, you will get to the point that you're enforcing like the Roman Catholic Church. That since you know better, you'll have the police out, as they are in Saudi Arabia, rounding up people who don't dress neatly and appropriately or aren't covered well enough. So once you respect religious activity by law, I mean, beyond just allowing it an even playing field and don't inhibit it, as the First Amendment says, but once you pass some regulations that are purposely designed to uphold the state, and one of them was just approved recently, a bill through Congress, and I don't know if the Senate's passed it yet, that would, after a disaster, use government money to build the churches. Once you accept that, and here now all the churches are built by the government, and the biggest churches built by the government will get the most government support, it's just a short circuit to the government showing particular favour to those mainline churches and turning a cold shoulder to the ones that they see as threatening, / Muslims, snake handlers and so on. Seventh-day Adventists, maybe.
How's that division of state and church?
It's not. I think it's a very bad law, even though it doesn't stop you and me from going to church and practicing our faith, but it has everything to do with the government moving in to direct involvement with specific churches. And they always used to say, follow the money. If the government's spending millions of dollars on building churches, you better believe they'll show an interest in what happens in those churches and to those churches. Yeah.
Somebody brought up in our church board meeting, after Washington State decided to allow gays to marry, that we should have a statement in our church policy or on our application for the use of the building or something like that, that we do not permit celebrations or marriages between same-sex couples. Do we go there?
I wouldn't make the statement. That would just be begging to have a reaction. But I would hope that's how we act. And at the moment, churches are given the exemption, but that probably won't last long. And in Canada, they're expecting any time to be forced to perform gay marriages, forced to hire and not able to fire church workers, including pastors who might declare stance. So yeah, we're on the edge of some really interesting stuff. But you've got to see the distinction between the state passing rights and privileges for gay people. I mean, that's a sign of public immorality, but it isn't really a restriction of our practice of religion. And there's the risk if we become religious one-noters, where this is the most offensive thing on the face of the planet to us, and we're not troubled by gross dishonesty and heartlessness in society by the government and businesses, if we're not troubled by degradation of the world by businesses that are just chuffing out stuff that's destroying our environment. We've got to have a broader interest than just that. But we're about to cross the line where this privileged class will turn around and demand that we give them what they want, and some things we can't.
It's in the news media. I just saw a program on it in the news before I came here. The bakery that doesn't want to bake cakes or do stuff for gay couples is now highly criticized and threatened by many people.
Well, that's something that if you have a business to the public, you really got to make up your mind. I don't think it's necessarily against a Christian's principles. If you're selling bread in a bakery to sell to gays, why,
Doing cakes and doing their wedding.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If you're in a public business, you're not necessarily endorsing that person's lifestyle by serving them with whatever it is you give. People got to think a little bit about that. Remember, Jesus met with publicans and sinners. He met with them. It's enabling them is another thing. If you're doing something that supports their lifestyle, you're not to. In the Bible, it condemns facilitating witchcraft. And I think this gets close to that. If we're doing something that makes it easier for the gay lifestyle to practice, then we're culpable. But if we're just neutral toward it and treat all sinners the same, and if you're a shopkeeper, sell to everyone that comes there. If you're a car repair place, what would it matter if gays or otherwise are coming? You can't ostracize people. Jesus said to the woman and said, I don't condemn you. And in fact, ironically, you can't condemn a non-believer for really anything. It's a person that's made a profession that you can claim that they're abusing their faith in God. But a non-believer, you just presume they're off base on everything, and you have to reach out to reclaim them. But at the base of it, it is true. And what you're saying is true. And in Canada, in fact, in a couple of days, I'm recording with the religious liberty lady from Canada. What's her name? Not Faith, Hope. Her name is something like that. I'm recording with her, and I know that she'll go on and on about this because they're very troubled. There's already been some legal statements from judges. Like one judge in Canada said, and I've been saying this for a couple of years, but he laid it out there, and it's just sort of hanging. He said that in Canada, to merely repeat some of the Bible texts on homosexuality without comment, just straight from the Bible, is a civil offense, and you could be jailed for that. They haven't actually done it yet, but that's a legal opinion gone out. So it's not a matter of you making a statement or doing something that proves that you are personally prejudiced. You just vocalize what anyone that reads the Bible holds, and you could be legally culpable.
I have a comment to your comment, is that this bakery was doing cakes and weddings, everything for these very same people before they got the right to get married. And then she had this big problem.
So they were trying to make a political statement, yeah.
So it was really kind of
strange. Yeah. This gay thing is amazing. I think about it a lot now because, it troubles me. It's a topic that I don't think, at least I don't think men like talking much about it because it's very icky. But I never thought it would come this far so quick. And looking back, and I don't really know what was the jumping off point. I know roughly when it was. It was the Lawrence v. Kansas case. Remember, these two fellows were in a private home, and the neighbours complained about the noise, and the police came, and then it went up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court did all that they really could do in that case, because there is a protection of privacy. They were in a private home. But somehow, in invoking privacy, that just catapulted gay behaviour into normalcy. But that's the best that I can think looking back on it. But I'm bringing that up for a reason. We're arguing the wrong point. The point is not whether gays can be married or whether they can have this right or that right. The real point is whether gay behaviour is acceptable in our society. And we're so past that one that it's ridiculous. But after the fact, to say they can't have what amounts to a marriage relationship is just being mean-spirited. And that's what I think some Christians are doing. We don't have to worry about it being a real marriage. It never could be. God's not going to sanctify such a thing, and the church should never, hopefully our church would never perform a ceremony, which even if they did, would not be binding. But they could call it all they want. But just think about the logic of it. If the society has decided this sort of behaviour is acceptable, then it's reasonable that they have medical insurance like anyone else. It's reasonable that they have hospital visitation. It's reasonable that they have inheritance rights. We're sort of getting mixed up on things. We don't like them having it because we don't like such people. And so it's prejudice now is playing. And I don't know if we can ever get back to the first cause, but I don't think the society adequately discussed the underlying morality of allowing this sort of behaviour. And an editorial the other day, I tried to write about it, not on religious liberty. I said, this is one of the most massive social experiments ever done. This will likely have greater ramifications than the Industrial Revolution that brought people from the farm to the city, broke up families, put kids in the mines at 7 years of old age, and so on. I mean, there were incredibly bad things that happened to Western society because of that. And so on this. And just the immediate first one is it will accelerate the decline in birth rates in Western countries, which is already a massive problem, is already behind the huge number of guest workers in Germany and France and so on. Guest workers with a strange culture and a threatening religion. You know, this sort of thing you might think is just socially troubling, but you might not realize it has the ability to destroy everything. And I don't think there's been adequate discussion on it. Two more questions, then we'll finish there. I think this is a good time to finish, 8:30.
Universities now are finding out that years ago when they started accepting money from the government is now stepping in and telling them how to develop their curriculum. When I was president of Dr. Moore's organization for homeschoolers, I was sitting with Focus on the Family with the president there, and Dobson, and I asked him, I said, when this national Sunday law goes through, which you know it's going to go through, and he said, yes, I do. I've read The Great Controversy and that also. I said, what are Seventh-day Adventists going to do? He said, you're either going to float with us or sink by yourself.
Yeah.
It's that simple. And that was back in 1993. So, where we are today.
Well, once a full-blown Sunday law comes, there's probably not much you can do, and it'll finally have a death penalty, and then it's just run for the hills. But building up to it, yeah, I've felt for a long time that homeschooling is very important because it's the ability of Christian families to inculcate values to their children. It's also the ability of them to bypass the mandatory education by the state, which, you know, it seems fairly benign to most people. But if you study the state education, it's anything but benign. Education was originally by the churches. It was moral education. The state took it over again, with the Industrial Revolution, when it had a need to suit people ideologically and by training to its own needs. I mean, it's not illogical, but people don't really think through it. It's not state generosity. It's incredibly narrow interest of the state's needs, and it wants to make compliant creatures. So if we've got a state that's moving into immoral behavior, like advocating gay behavior, if we've got a state, as the US is, that's totally embraced a Darwinian view of business activity, so it's basically abusing the rights of the individual for monetary purposes. You've got to suspect the education department. And so I think there's a reasonable argument that Christians could educate their kids at home. And I think it's very significant that throughout the Western world, and in some degree in this country, there are moves against people of deviant religious views teaching their kids at home. And you've got to really watch that. Because when a Sunday law comes, yes. Remember, part of the Sunday law, at least in the communist countries and other places we've seen, is it mixes it changes the mix on education. And very likely, Adventist young kids would be required to go to school on Sabbath. So you've got a direct religious conflict. And the first issue of Liberty magazine that I had an article by Raymond Moore on homeschooling, and periodically I pop up with it, and I had one within the last year, or time gets by, but it seems like about the last year, from Sweden, where the secular state there, not pushing a religious viewpoint as the US often does, or a cultural religious viewpoint. They're just opposed to religion, and they're forbidding the parents from teaching religious values. And we had the article on that, and it just hit me. Grace McIntosh is the name I couldn't remember before. And Grace McIntosh the other day was saying that in Canada they've just passed some legislation that makes it an offense for parents who are homeschooling children in the home environment, not just during the formal homeschooling period, if they communicate to their children, verbalize to them some critical attitudes about gay behavior and so on. They can be charged and lose their children. So homeschooling is very important. It's one of the frontiers of religious liberty. Yeah.
That is just the point I was trying to make, is where we have the First Amendment passed by our forefathers, godly men, to prohibit one religion from taking over the government. However, if somebody has got to make the laws, is it righteous people that are going to make the laws, or is it ungodly people? Now, the Bible says in Proverbs, in 11, verse 10, when it goes well with the righteous, the city rejoices. And when the wicked perish, there is jubilation. By the blessing of the upright, the city is exalted. But if the wicked are in power, let me read this other one in chapter, I can't read it. In chapter 29, verse 2, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked man rules, the people groan. Now, do we want righteous people in power, or do we want wicked people in power?
Well, we do. Of course, it's very hard for you and I to tell who's a righteous person. That's the problem. It's very hard for you and I to tell who's a righteous person. That's the problem if you apply that too literally. Then you have I would rather put it on a more general sense. As societal morality declines, obviously the state of government generally will become more and more immoral. And so there's a positive leavening effect, if I can use that term, if you have more and more committed Christians. But to vote for people sort of on a litmus test as though, is this person a committed Christian or is this person not? You'll probably end up with right-wing religionists running government, and a lot of them probably are hypocrites. You know, like on this gay marriage thing, I wrote something on our website the other day that, again, I don't know that people notice what I put, but I made some comment about the priests. We should be careful we don't criticize this while the priest thing hangs out there. And now I've forgotten his name. There was a Protestant evangelist caught with a gay prostitute. Remember that? No, that guy recently. He's been cured since. In fact, it was a misunderstanding, I think. But the point is, a lot of these people put themselves up as great high ideals, and it's just hypocrisy of the first degree. We should judge people by their actions, not by their profession. And there's lots of these politicians. Maybe I'm more cynical in Washington, but I see them all the time. They're all great. When the moment demands it, if they're talking to Christian writers, they're all godly people. And yet you need to look at what they're promoting. And so the best thing is to judge them on their track record. And the Bible says that too, by their fruits you shall know them. And so if we have people that are of biblically based lifestyle morality more and more in society, it will percolate up and we will have better government. But I agree with your statement, but it's just a nice time to throw in complications. I believe the United States has had a wonderful gift with its Constitution. It's been informed by many people that wanted religious freedom, but the Constitution is not as watertight as you think. It's a human instrument, and people that study the Constitution know that all is not what it seems. The original intention of the First Amendment was to keep the federal government out of the religion business. It's very easy to prove that many, if not most, of the framers of that Constitution were not only comfortable with, they expected established religion in their states. And the reason we don't have that now is because of the Civil War, which had a very good byproduct for religious freedom, that it applied the First Amendment everywhere, but it had a very negative effect for end-time events because it meant that an oppressive federal government is now possible, a government that can, once lamb-like, that can speak like a dragon and compel. The federal government under the original Constitution could not have done that. And we need to understand that as Seventh-day Adventist Americans. There's been a change. It's the first huge change was the Civil War, and constantly the screws are down. Since 9/11, Homeland Security is another thing. And Homeland Security has everything to do with religion. Of necessity, it's the war against terror, and it's a war against a certain view of radical religion.
So do you encourage Seventh-day Adventists to run for office?
I wouldn't. I think it's, Ellen White speaking about, I spent a long time in the publishing houses, so I'll just draw the analogy. She says many times, and I studied this topic with Raymond Moore, by the way, talking about books and what we should publish. And remember, that was central to Adventism, getting the word out like the leaves of autumn. And she said there are many things that are good, that other Christians can do, but Adventists are not to do it. There's a class of books we're not to print. There's a message we're not to give. We are to focus on present truth. And so if we start encouraging Adventists to enter politics and make their influence felt, I think that's buying into the agenda of the here and now. It's buying into a secular agenda. It's not wrong if by happenstance some Adventist ends up there. I think it's hazardous, but if we as a church start encouraging people to go into politics wholesale, I think it'll be a sign we've lost our way. And Ellen White has a lot of things to say about political involvement. I was just reading some in the hotel coming here. She's specific on it, but whenever she talks about ministers and teachers getting politically involved, she said they should be resign or be fired. It's anathema. It's not forbidden to a general member, but I think the caution would still be there. It's enchanted ground. That's what it is. It's losing your priority. It's not that people in government can't do good things. Where I would make a bit of an exception or a difference is there's many government positions that are appointments that are in civil service. That's their callings and jobs and responsibilities like all other aspects of society. But to choose a political career where you come before the public, you campaign, you raise funds. Remember, campaigning is not just getting up and giving a nice speech. It's in the smoke-filled back room, promising this and that with this and that nefarious group, lying your head off to this group, saying the same to another. I mean, it's very corrupt. It always was tainted, and it's become corrupt in our era, particularly on the federal level. I'll finish, well, it's not a good thing to finish on, but I better finish with this. A few years ago, I was talking to the workers' meeting in Greater New York. I've been there about 4 times, so at least they keep getting me back. And I got onto this topic, and man, did I get a reaction. Maybe 20 of the pastors started taking me on, really differing with, oh no, Adventists can go into politics and all the rest. And halfway through the discussion, I realized why they were so worked up, because at that time, an Adventist had just been elected mayor of Philadelphia. John Street, I think was his name. So suddenly it was great here. Adventist was in power, because we were in Greater New York, probably the meeting place was probably 50, 60 miles from Philadelphia. And it didn't end very well. I stuck to my point, in fact, but as I left, I had to leave to drive back. As I was walking down the aisle, they were yelling stuff out of me. It's quite interesting. I came back next year, not a word. You know what happened in between? John Street and about 4 of his associates were caught with bribes and all sorts of gross immorality. The whole thing collapsed like a deck of cards. It's not true every time, but it's the prevailing pattern in government. It doesn't, again, it goes to the point raised here. There's a very low level of morality in these people. It's not that they're all crooks or criminals, but they're all part of a dissipated system of influence and basically lying. There was a classic situation with Harry Truman, who I think was a good enough president, although whether dropping the atomic bomb makes him good, I don't know. But Harry Truman at least functioned well as a good president. But, you know, he was put up as a candidate by Pendergrast in, I'm trying to think of the city in Missouri. Oh, what was the city? Anyhow, Pendergrast was a mafia boss in that city, a total crook and a criminal. And Harry Truman made a comment. I think it was just after he was elected to Congress. And he said, just because I was put into power by a criminal doesn't mean that I can't be an honest politician. Now, I think it does. But they'll show you he was very conscious of the underworld connection with him getting into office. He would never have gotten into office except that the underworld sponsored him and promoted him and put him in place. And the reverse is true. If he had not had the support of them, they would keep him out. It's sad to think that, but you know, it's not long since we saw the Abramoff thing in Washington. The influence of big money is pervasive. I don't really know the answer, and you know, we're not called to be political activists. The simple answer is, as was said, we need a moral change in the country. But in the interim, I do not think Adventists should take it on themselves to change governmental morality. That's not our job. Our job is to change spiritual views within Christendom and be repairers of the breach and proclaimers of the soon coming of Christ. Well, thank you for your attention, and we'll see what tomorrow brings. Let's have a word of benediction as we close. Dear Lord, we thank you for the great charge that you've given to each of us to follow you, and as Seventh-day Adventists to live lives of preparation and to warn the world while there's yet time that they too can be part of your coming kingdom, and that there's a consequence if they ignore that. Thank you for this privilege. Thank you for the message of religious liberty. Thank you for this church and each person here, and may we each be strengthened and encouraged to follow you, to live for you, and to witness for you. For Jesus' sake, amen.